Hi everyone, before we get started, I'd like to point you over to christianjohnsondrums.com for a free PDF download of every exercise I play in this video. You'll also notice that I've done full text transcriptions of this lesson as well as all my previous lessons so that you can follow along at your own pace. The link for this lesson is in the description below. Let's begin. So in the previous video, we learned that syncopation is a musical term that describes what happens when we play a weak beat with the emphasis of a strong beat. Now, the definition can be hard to grasp unless you can hear what's happening. So what I did was I played a few examples, and I took what would normally sound like a strong beat, say beat 1 with a kick drum and a crash on the drum set. And I played those sounds on the and of 4, and then in another example I played it on the and of 1. And what I've done is I've actually kind of created this illusion. The listener wants to hear the crash and kick drum on beat 1, and instead it comes early, technically early on the and of 4. It's a really weak place in the measure with a strong sound. And that sound changes the feel of the groove significantly. And that's what we call syncopation. Syncopation is the change in feel where you don't expect there to be a strong sound or a strong emphasis, and now there is one. And we would call those beats syncopated. Now, 16th note syncopation works exactly the same way. What we're doing is we're taking the weakest part of the measure, the 16th note upbeat, which would be the E or the within a beat, and we're playing it with the same sort of emphasis that we would play an 8th note or stronger. So I've put together another version of that coin animation to show you how that works. Again, I have 16 glasses on a table, representing all of the 16th notes in a measure of 4/4 time. I'm going to add a coin to each glass, representing where we would normally play quarter notes, 8th notes, and 16th notes. I'll start with quarter notes. That's because we're looking at syncopation within the subdivisions of a beat, so I'll need to include the beat in this chart. To show where we normally play quarter notes, I'll add a coin to each numbered glass. Next, we'll look at the first subdivision, the 8th note. I'll add a coin to each beat again, and then I'll go back and add a coin to each upbeat. Finally, since this is all about 16th note syncopation, I'll add a coin to each glass on the table. We end up with a chart of the strong and weak subdivisions within a measure. In this case, the beats are the strongest parts of the measure. The next strongest are the 8ths, and the weakest are still the 16ths. In 16th note syncopation, we want to emphasize those weak 16ths. So let's look at beat 1 and say that we choose to emphasize the E using syncopation. We would extend its duration and or accent it to get the right effect. But then we also have to de-emphasize that and to make room for the new emphasis. Let's look at beat 2. I want to emphasize the in beat 2. It's another weak subdivision of the beat. Now to syncopate this 16th, I have to de-emphasize the 3. In this case, the hangs over beat 3. Otherwise, it wouldn't sound syncopated. Now I'd like to point out that the number of coins in the glasses do not directly relate to quarter notes or 8th notes. They're supposed to represent the ups and downs in the flow of music. The amount of accent or emphasis is going to be dictated by the music you're playing. The composer, the conductor, your bandmates, and you will decide exactly how dramatic the syncopation will be,
and it will all come down to musical taste. So before we move on, let's listen to how 16th note syncopation can affect a rock beat. In the first example, I'll be playing a heavy emphasis on the of beat 4, the last 16th note. I'll be playing 2 measure phrases, just like in the first video. The first measure is straight ahead. The second measure will contain the syncopation. In the second example, I'll be putting the emphasis on the E of beat 4. But you'll notice that in this case, I kept the emphasis on beat 1. That's because it's very musically effective to do that. And like I said, the syncopation is all about what you and your bandmates and the composer and what the music calls for. So in this example, I'm going to play a crash on the first beat of measure 1 only. Then I will syncopate the E of beat 4 in the second measure. Let's check that out.
So that's a musical concept behind syncopation, and hopefully you can hear what it's done to our typical rock groove. Now we're going to check out some notation by looking at the opening exercise and see how it's written. I wrote some music that includes a good sampling of typical syncopated 16th note rhythms. What you should notice is that I have 8th notes in positions where you would normally see 16th notes, specifically 8th notes on the E's and Ahs. So let's take a look at these rhythms in depth.
Since we're talking about 16th note syncopation, we'll start with 2 beats of 16th notes. Each pair of 16ths takes up the same amount of time as a single 8th note. And so far in these lessons, when 8ths and 16ths were mixed within a beat, everything happened in line with the pulse of the 8th notes. We've seen rhythms like this before. In beat 1, we have an 8th note and 2 16ths, and then in beat 2, it's the opposite. 2 16ths followed by an 8th note. Nice and lined up with the 8th note pulse. But are those the only 2 pairs of 16ths in these beats? What about these pairs of 16ths? Well, those 2 16ths can also be combined to equal a single 8th note, and that's how we would syncopate the E of these 2 beats. We give it emphasis and duration by making it an 8th note, and by default, that makes the beat on the upbeats, the and, de-emphasized. Let's take a closer look at this rhythm. In the first measure, you'll see the rhythm as it is written in music. From left to right, it includes a 16th note. You can see that it has a double beam, an 8th note with a single beam, and a final 16th note. In the second measure, you can see how it's played. It's very important to notice that the second and third 16ths are tied together. That's because the duration of the E needs to last for 2 16ths, or an 8th note. Just like we saw in the video for 8th note syncopation, the increase in duration creates the change in emphasis. In the last measure, you can see how to count it. You would play the beat, the E, you don't play on the and you play on the This exercise also has a few other syncopated rhythms to note. In this measure, we don't just have an 8th note playing on the E, we have a dotted 8th note. If you remember back to the lesson on dots and ties, you'll know that the dot means to extend the rhythm by half. In this case, a dotted 8th note is worth 3 16th notes. Remember, the idea of syncopation is about creating emphasis, primarily by lengthening the duration of weak notes. So a dotted 8th here definitely lengthens the E, but it also keeps the total rhythmic duration within the time signature. The last rhythm we'll look at closely is this syncopation on the of beat 1. You'll notice that it's tied to beat 2 and not replaced by an 8th note. I looked around in my drum books and I found that in general 16th note syncopation that went over the beat in this way was written with tied notes. My best guess for the reason why is that it's easier to see the beats of the measure when it's written this way.
So now bring back that original exercise so you can read along. You should understand the rhythms a lot better now, and I'll do an interpretation of it on the snare drum. Now that you've heard it on the snare drum and can kind of understand what the rhythms are about a little bit more, I'll do my drum set interpretation again between the snare drum and the hi-hat and kick. All right, so that is it for the syncopation portion of the rhythm and reading series. That is a mouthful, man. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully you can hear how important syncopation is to the modern music we listen to. It's really shaped music for the last 100 years, and it's such an important concept, and it's undoubtedly something you've heard. Now you know it has a name, syncopation. It is the accenting of a weak beat or weak subdivision within a measure, the emphasis of a weak beat or weak subdivision in a measure to absolutely change the flow and shape of the music. It's all about the sound. So if you want to practice more rhythms just like this, there are 2 books you could check out. There's Joel Rothman's Teaching Rhythm and Ted Reed's Progressive Steps to Syncopation for the Modern Drummer. They both pretty much cover the same material. There's standard rhythms in the beginning, and then they get into syncopation towards the middle of the book. But I definitely highly recommend either one of them for exercises. Finally, you can check out christianjohnsondrums.com for a full text transcription of this lesson, plus my other lessons, PDF downloads of the examples, as well as a scheduler for private lessons. Now, I do teach privately, and if you have any questions about this lesson or any of the other lessons, if you want to take drum set lessons with me, I would really appreciate it, and I'd love to give it back to you. So on my website, there's a scheduler. Pick a date and time that works for you, and let's get together. Until then, please like, subscribe, ring the little bell, and I'll see you next time.